Hello everyone, my name is Keiko Bridwell and I'll be presenting today on my research with Dr. Margaret Renwick on social predictors of the wine-whine merger in the US South. So historically, English distinguished between a voiced and a voiceless labiovelar glide, w and fw, with this fw sound being found in words that begin with an orthographic wh, such as what, where, whisper, and so forth. And I personally have this sound in my dialect, so you will be hearing me use this fw sound sporadically throughout the talk. But the wine-whine merger refers to the process by which w assimilates with voiced w, leading to the neutralization of minimal pairs such as wine and whine. And in the majority of English dialects worldwide, this merger is either complete or nearing completion. The two major exceptions to this are Scottish English, where what is still a very robust feature, and Southern American English, although as I'll be discussing today, it's possible that this status has shifted more recently. What is certain is that variation between voiceless and voiced glides for WH words has been around since the very beginnings of American English, but that the merger only began to gain ground on a widespread basis over the past century or less. And there have been very few studies directly targeting the wine-whine merger in US English, but we can see evidence of its spread by looking at dialect surveys taken several decades apart. So in the pronunciation of English in the Atlantic states, which was part of the Linguistic Atlas Project surveys collected in the 1940s, it was found that the glides had merged in 3 port areas represented in the blue isoglosses on the map. And then in the Atlas of North American English from data collected in the 90s, the merger had spread everywhere except inside the red isogloss, so essentially everywhere except the southeastern US. More recently, I've conducted some research that has begun to provide an idea of what the social indices surrounding fw today might be. So in a study looking at recorded speech from the International Dialects of English Archive, I found a decreasing effect of date of birth among speakers from the South and West dialect regions, as defined by the Atlas of North American English, with a similar trending effect among speakers from the Midlands. And this study drew from a small sample, but among the speakers examined, the results indicated that fw was essentially absent among all age groups in the North Central, Inland North, and New England dialect regions, that it was present in the oldest generation in the West and Midlands, and that it was present among older and middle-aged speakers in the South. So this backed up previous evidence from the dialect surveys that fw had persevered longest in the South, but it also indicated that it was disappearing among younger speakers there as well. Then similarly, in a second study I conducted based on interviews with 25 Southern speakers born from 1933 to 1997, there was a decreasing effect of date of birth with very few speakers born after 1965 using fw, as you can see in the diagram on this slide. And interestingly, in this study, there seem to be 2 patterns in fw usage. So among speakers born before 1950, the ones who were more rural and less educated tended to use fw more. And among the ones born after 1950, the ones who used fw tended to be the ones who were less rural or more educated. And I later looked at a subset of this data focusing on a particular area in upstate South Carolina. And among those speakers, the ones who reported low attachment to their local area were more likely to use fw than the ones who were highly attached to where they lived. So these 2 findings together suggest that some speakers were potentially treating fw as a marker of educatedness, non-rurality, or non-southernness. So these were my findings related to how fw patterns in current speech. However, it was difficult to find statistically reliable patterns beyond age, partly because the majority of this data did come from a small data set with 25 interviews, and it was compounded by the fact that, as you can see in the graph, about 8 of these speakers born after 1970 were difficult to analyze at all because they simply seemed not to have fw due to age and couldn't be analyzed for other social variables much further. So for this project, we wanted to go back and look at an earlier data set to get an idea of where and when the wine-whine merger first started gaining ground in the South, and if any patterns emerged along other social axes there. So to accomplish this, for the current project, we looked at the Digital Archive of Southern Speech, or DAS, which is an audio corpus of interviews collected from 1968 to 1983 as part of the Linguistic Atlas of the Gulf States. These recordings were transcribed, and the transcriptions aligned with the recordings by a research team at the University of Georgia. And DAS contains 372 hours of audio from 64 speakers across 8 southern states, with birth dates ranging from 1886 to 1965, and it's encoded for numerous social attributes. So altogether, these characteristics make it possible to measure the state of the wine-whine merger at a time when it seems likely to have been at a transitional stage in the American South, and to compare its progress among speakers from a wide range of backgrounds. So for this project, our research questions started with, how does FWA use pattern with age in the DAS corpus? So would the wine-whine merger have even started in the US South by the 1970s? If so, would FWA use decrease with age, as had been seen in previous studies? And if so, when would this pattern begin? We also wanted to look at how FWA use might vary across geographic regions within the South, and at what role education would play with respect to the wine-whine merger. And then finally, we wanted to take a look and see how FWA patterned with race, since this is something that hadn't been investigated by any previous studies. We did have a small pilot study using data from the choral corpus, and it indicated that among Black speakers in Princeville, North Carolina, FWA use did decrease with date of birth, and it seemed to occur at similar frequencies to the white speakers in the previous study mentioned. But we wanted to see whether this would play out with the broader range of data from the DAS corpus as well. So to create the corpus of potential FWA words for this project, we started out by searching through the DAS transcriptions and found words with morpheme initial WH, excluding words where the WH came before a round vowel and would be pronounced without a glide, like who or whole, and so forth. And we limited our list to words with at least 15 tokens to avoid extremely rare words like whippletree, and for words with over 1,000 tokens each, to avoid washing out our corpus with the most frequent words like what and when, we only took the first 15 tokens for each speaker. So these words would have a maximum of 960 tokens each. We then listened to each of the audio clips to see if the correct word was in the vicinity of the forced alignment and discarded the ones that weren't. And then finally, for the coding process, my co-author and I each coded half of the tokens by listening to each word, examining the spectrogram in prot, and labeling it as either an instance of WA or FWA. And for any tokens there was any confusion about, we cross-checked each other on these. So at the end of this process, we had a total of 7,702 WH tokens. For the variables we considered for this project, we drew all speaker level categories from the metadata provided in DAS by the original Linguistic Atlas Project researchers. And these include date of birth, gender, geographic location, which is divided into 6 land regions, race, which was coded as either Black or non-Black, education, social class, locality, and worldview. And then for linguistic variables, we included lexical content, which was a variable that was previously found to have an effect on FWA rates, the quality of the following vowel, and the position of the WH in the word. So starting out with the raw results, overall, most speakers showed a high rate of FWA usage. Most of them used it more than 50% of the time, and all but 8 used it more than 10% of the time. And one thing that's particularly interesting is that no one used either variant 100% of the time. They all varied between some use of FWA and WA, which indicates that unlike in the more recent studies where some of the younger speakers didn't seem to have acquired a FWA sound at all, these speakers all possessed some representation of FWA but varied in how often they used it at a statistical level. And as you can see here, where the results are divided by gender and race, men and women patterned more or less the same. There were some older male speakers around the 1890 range that showed slightly lower rates than female speakers of the same age, but for the most part, these two groups were similar. With respect to race, however, we do see an interesting pattern in relation to age, which you can see even more clearly with a smoothed plot. And as you can see in this graph, Black speakers seem to be fairly similar to non-Black speakers up to a certain point in the timeline. But after that point, somewhere in this range here, they showed a sharp decrease that wasn't present among the non-Black speakers. Then looking at the results at the word level, all function words behaved fairly similarly. They were pronounced with voiceless W between 40 and 75% of the time, regardless of where the WH appeared in the word. For content words, however, the range was much wider. So wet and whetstone, the first two columns in that leftmost graph, were pronounced with W 100% of the time, and wet rock was pronounced with W 92% of the time. So this suggests that this particular word family has a particularly high association with the W sound. And one possibility for this to explain this is that it forms a minimal pair with wet, which can appear in a lot of the same grammatical context, like whet the knife versus wet the knife, or whetstone versus whetstone. Most of the other content words hovered between 70 and 80%, so generally higher than the average function word, which is something found in previous studies as well. And then finally, there were two words that behaved somewhat as exceptions. There was coach whip, which was appeared with 36% of the time, and it was the only content word where WH appeared internally. And then there was wharf at 6%, which is a particularly interesting case. So in very early dialect studies, part of the Linguistic Atlas Project, McDavid and McDavid noted that the word wharf was one of the earliest to adopt the merger in the eastern US. And this was attributed to it being a word describing ports that would be more likely to be used in those port cities that were the first to adopt the wine-whine merger. So it seems very likely that by the time of the DAS interviews, wharf had been lexicalized as having a voiced W, even in the speech of people who maintain the distinction. So the 16 tokens of this word were removed from the study for the rest of the statistical analysis, leaving 7,686 tokens. Next, to test our research questions in more detail, we fit a mixed effects logistic regression model in R. And for this model, the dependent variable was whether the token was realized as W or W. For random effects, we had speaker, word, and coder. And for fixed effects, we searched for the best fitting model using all of the social variables coded in the DAS metadata, in addition to lexical content following vowel and word position. Now, for the continuous variable of date of birth, based on our visual inspection of the raw data, we noted that the prevalence of W had a different trajectory before and after about 1930, especially if you took race into account, which meant that treating it as a linear relationship wasn't going to capture the true structure very well. So to account for this, we modified the model to create a piecewise regression for date of birth with a breakpoint at 1930. And we used a continuous piecewise regression, meaning that the lines on either side of the breakpoint meet in the middle, since this would approximate the expected type of linguistic change that we expected to see. And then additionally, as we saw in the graphs of the raw data, there seemed to be an interaction present between date of birth and race, so we built that into the model as well, and it did in fact improve the fit. From there, we added in the other variables as fixed effects until we found the model of best fit. And this model ended up including, in addition to the interaction between race and date of birth, the linguistic variables of lexical content and following vowel, and the social variables of land, region, and education. So looking at the model results, what we see is a significant interaction between race and date of birth, as well as significant main effects of both of these variables. And specifically, what we see when this is plotted out is that in the first half of the date of birth regression, the part before 1930, the Black speakers and the non-Black speakers behave fairly similarly with a large amount of overlap in the confidence intervals. The Black speakers did have slightly lower W usage, but it didn't appear to be significant most of the time. In the second half of the regression, however, both groups significantly decreased. However, there was a lot less overlap, with non-Black speakers using W significantly more, and Black speakers almost reaching 0% by the final birth date of 1965. Now, one thing you might notice about this graph is that the line for the non-Black speakers decreases a lot more sharply than what we saw when looking at the raw data. And part of that is an artifact of the way the model was constructed, but also that's because other factors need to be taken into account as well, which we'll talk about next. So for the other variables in the model, content words had a significantly higher realization as hua than function words. For vowel, words containing used hua more than words containing which is likely an effect of that family of huet words. Then for the social variables, the coast region, which is made up of the body of Florida, used hua significantly less often than the highlands, Piedmont, piney woods, and plains regions. And the Delta region, which is most of Louisiana and the area along the Mississippi River, used hua significantly less than the highlands or piney woods. And finally, those speakers with a college education used hua significantly more than those without one. And this last finding could potentially account for the discrepancy between the model trajectory for non-Black speakers and the raw data, because the majority of them non-Black speakers, all but two of them who were born after 1930, were college educated. And so we would expect to see that extra addition of education to their predicted results. So overall, this corpus study highlighted variation in the pronunciation of WH words, with specifically all DAS speakers using hua in variation with hua. And most of the words we sampled varied as well. And these findings are particularly interesting given that in present day data, many people categorically do not use hua at all, while in the DAS data, this feature was actually quite robust. And then on the flip side, the merger was also present in the speech of every speaker. So this was a form of variation that was present in everyone's speech, but according to our other findings, it was possibly socially salient in the extent to which it was used. So looking at individual variables in terms of age, what we saw is that at the time these interviews were collected, there was approximately stable variation between hua and hua among people born up to 1930, after which hua use decreased, especially among Black speakers. And one of the most striking results from the study was the trajectory of hua among Black speakers, which hadn't previously been investigated. There was a sharp decrease in hua use among Black speakers born after 1930, with the merger almost completing by a birth year of 1965. But prior to 1930, Black speakers in this corpus didn't use hua significantly less than non-Black speakers. And putting this into a broader historical context, this matches research that suggests that early versions of African American English tended to be more aligned with the local European American varieties than it is today. And these studies also suggest that this changed as African Americans began migrating out of the rural South in what is known as the Great Migration toward the urban North and West, as well as to urban areas within the South. These studies also note that especially after the second wave of this migration, which started in the 1940s, African American language started to orient toward the varieties found in urban centers. And we do see evidence from previous studies that Black Southern speakers born after World War II do in fact start diverging away from local rural varieties and converging toward urban AAL features. So it's possible that the pattern we see with hua in the DAS data parallels similar shifts in African American language around the same time. And then finally, returning to the concept of Southernness, this study found that the areas that used hua more frequently are those that tend to pattern linguistically with Southern American English, and that those that use hua less are those that tend to linguistically diverge from it, like Florida and Louisiana. And this matches the results we see for the wine-whine merger in the Atlas of North American English, so some of those patterns were already forming at this time. So in this sense, hua was indeed a marker of Southern speech. However, the results also showed that people with a college education used hua more frequently. And what's interesting is that this suggests that some of the people who are using hua perceive it to be the prestigious form, despite the fact that according to the regional results, it's a feature of Southern speech and therefore might be expected to be considered non-standard. So what we're likely seeing here is an orthographic effect, There have been many largely unsuccessful pushes to retain the H sound in WH words for hundreds of years at this point, as part of this prescriptive belief that you should pronounce all the letters in a word. And it's possible that this ideology was just more successful in the South, where this was already a feature that was regularly encountered. And this may also help to explain some of the behaviors in more recent data, where Hua was again more prevalent among middle-aged people with higher education. So overall, social factors were able to explain a great deal of the variation between Hua and Hua at a time and place when the distinction was still robust. And this study shows a complex picture of how this variable interacted with age, race, location, and education. So we hope that this study is able to provide a fuller picture of the history of the Hua variable and its particular sociolinguistic role in the South. So here are our references, and thank you for attending our talk, and we would welcome any questions in the discussion section.